At some point on the path of awakening, many people experience a profound and deeply unsettling realization. It feels as though everything they once relied on for stability, meaning, and identity is quietly slipping away. Relationships that once felt solid begin to feel distant. Goals that once gave direction suddenly seem artificial or empty. Even the image you had of yourself, who you believed you were, what you thought your life was about, starts to feel strangely unreal. And when this happens, the mind immediately reacts with fear. It says, "I'm losing everything. Something has gone terribly wrong." This isn't spiritual growth. This is collapse. But according to Alan Watts, this sense of loss is not awakening has failed. It is often the clearest sign that it is finally working. Alan Watts often spoke about awakening not as an addition to the self, but as a subtraction. He explained that awakening is not about becoming more, achieving more, or finally getting something you lacked. Instead, it is about seeing through the structures you once depended on to feel real and secure. And when those structures begin to dissolve, it feels exactly like losing everything. Because in a sense, you are. But what you are losing is not life itself. You are losing the illusions that once held your sense of self together. You see, most of what we call having a life is actually a carefully constructed arrangement of roles, expectations, habits, and stories. You are this kind of person. You are heading in this direction. Your life has this meaning. And as long as these stories remain unquestioned, they provide a kind of psychological shelter. They make existence feel manageable. But Alan Watts pointed out that these structures are not reality itself. They are symbols. They are maps, not the territory. An awakening begins the moment you realize you have been living inside the map. When this realization deepens, the mind panics. Because the map was what gave you orientation. Without it, you feel lost, disoriented, ungrounded. You may look at your life and think, "I don't recognize this anymore." Not because your life has changed, but because the lens through which you see it has. The very things that once reassured you now feel strangely hollow. And this hollow feeling is often misinterpreted as failure, depression, or regression. But Alan Watts would say that this is the moment when the ground you were standing on reveals itself to have been imaginary. The collapse feels total because it touches everything at once. Identity loosens. Meaning thins out. Motivation fades. And what replaces it is not clarity, but uncertainty. A vast, uncomfortable not knowing. And the mind calls this losing everything. But in truth, what is being lost is the false sense of control that came from believing you knew who you were and where you were going. Awakening does not destroy your life. It dismantles the illusion that your life needed to be held together by constant certainty. And this dismantling always feels like loss before it feels like freedom. As this collapse unfolds, one of the most disturbing aspects is the emotional confusion that accompanies it. You may notice that the things you once cared deeply about no longer move you in the same way. The ambitions that once fueled you now feel strangely foreign. Even the future, something you may have once planned meticulously, begins to lose its emotional pull. According to Alan Watts, this is not apathy. It is the loosening of attachment to symbols that no longer reflect your direct experience of reality. But when this happens, the mind interprets it as emptiness, as loss, as a kind of inner death. Alan Watts explained that the ego survives by projecting itself into time. It defines itself through past achievements and future goals. It says, "I am who I was, and I will be who I am becoming." When awakening deepens, this projection weakens. The future no longer feels compelling because the self that was reaching toward it is dissolving. And without that reaching, life can feel directionless. The mind becomes alarmed and asks, "If I am not moving toward something, then what am I doing?" But this question only arises because the ego cannot imagine existing without striving. This is why awakening often feels like stagnation or failure. From the ego's perspective, nothing is happening. There is no progress to measure, no identity to reinforce, no destination to aim for. And yet, Alan Watts would say that this apparent standstill is actually a return to something far more fundamental. It is a shift from living as a psychological project to simply existing as a living process. But because we are conditioned to equate meaning with movement, this return feels like collapse. During this phase, people often try to force themselves back into their old lives. They push themselves to care again, to want again, to desire again. They reattach to old roles or seek new ones, hoping to recover the sense of solidity they once had. But Alan Watts warned that this only deepens the suffering. Because once you have seen through the game of becoming, you cannot truly believe in it again. You can perform it, but it feels hollow. And this hollowness is not a flaw, it is the insight itself. The sense of losing everything intensifies because the ego has no reference point anymore. The familiar narrative of my life begins to unravel, and in its place there is only immediacy. Sensations, thoughts arising and passing. Moments unfolding without a central controller. This can feel deeply unsettling because the mind has been trained to believe that without a strong sense of self, everything will fall apart. But what Alan Watts emphasized is that life does not require a rigid identity to function. Breathing continues. The heart beats. The world moves on effortlessly. What is collapsing is not your ability to live, but your belief that you must constantly define, direct, and justify your existence. And when that belief weakens, the ego experiences it as annihilation. But from a deeper perspective, it is liberation beginning to take shape, quietly, invisibly, beneath the surface of what feels like loss. One of the reasons this phase is so frightening is that it strips away the emotional rewards that once reinforced your sense of identity. According to Alan Watts, most people do not realize how deeply their feeling of being someone depends on feedback from the world. Approval, recognition, usefulness, belonging. These are not just social comforts. They are the glue that holds the ego together. When awakening deepens, this glue begins to dissolve. And suddenly, you may feel invisible, unnecessary, or strangely detached from the social game you once played so naturally. This is often when people say, "I feel like I'm losing myself," and they are absolutely right. But what is being lost is not your true nature. It is the image of yourself that was maintained through constant interaction and validation. Alan Watts described the ego as a kind of social hallucination, something that exists primarily in relation to others. When the need for that reinforcement weakens, the ego experiences withdrawal. And like any withdrawal, it feels painful, disorienting, and deeply uncomfortable. You may notice that conversations feel superficial, that old friendships feel misaligned, that participating in social roles requires effort where it once felt automatic. This is not because you have become antisocial or broken. It is because you are no longer fully identified with the mask you used to wear. And once you see the mask as a mask, wearing it becomes exhausting. The effort it takes to pretend you are still the person you used to be creates a sense of inner fragmentation. You feel divided between who you appear to be and what you actually experience. Alan Watts often emphasized that society functions by encouraging people to confuse their roles with their being. You are your job. You are your personality. You are your reputation. But awakening begins when this confusion starts to clear. And as it clears, the structures that depended on that confusion begin to wobble. This is why awakening can feel like social death. You may feel as though you no longer belong anywhere. Not because you are excluded, but because you no longer fully participate in the illusion of belonging. This loss can trigger deep grief. Grief for the life you thought you were building. Grief for the certainty you once had. Grief for the person you believed yourself to be. And this grief is often misunderstood as regression. But according to Alan Watts, grief is a natural response when a false center dissolves. It is the mourning of an identity that once provided orientation, even if it was never truly real. What makes this phase particularly difficult is that there is no clear replacement yet. The old self is loosened, but the deeper recognition has not fully stabilized. You are suspended between worlds, too awake to return to the old story, but not yet grounded enough to rest in pure being. And in this suspension, everything can feel fragile, uncertain, as if life itself is slipping through your fingers. But Alan Watts would remind you that life was never something you were holding in the first place. The feeling of losing everything comes from the mistaken belief that you were ever in possession of it. What is actually happening is that the tension of holding on is being released. And while release feels like loss to the ego, it is relief to the deeper intelligence that has always been carrying you without effort. As this unraveling continues, another layer of fear often surfaces, the fear that without the old identity, nothing meaningful will replace it. The mind whispers, if I am no longer this person, then who am I? And because the mind can only think in terms of forms and definitions, it finds no answer. According to Alan Watts, this is the moment when the intellect reaches its limit. It cannot grasp what lies beyond identity, because identity itself is what the intellect is made of. And so it experiences silence as threat. Alan Watts frequently pointed out that the ego is like a knot tied in consciousness. It feels solid only because of tension. When that tension loosens, the knot begins to disappear. But from the knot's point of view, loosening feels like falling apart. This is why awakening often brings a deep sense of vulnerability. You may feel exposed, unprotected, as if the psychological armor you once relied on has been stripped away. And the instinctive reaction is to tighten again, to grab onto something familiar, something definable. This is why many people, at this stage, reach for new identities, spiritual identities, healer identities, teacher identities, labels that promise meaning and coherence. But Alan Watts warned that this is simply the ego changing costumes. The structure remains the same, only the content shifts. And so the collapse continues, because awakening is not satisfied with better stories. It is revealing the unreality of the storyteller itself. During this phase, you may feel unusually sensitive. Emotions arise without clear causes. A sense of sadness or nostalgia may appear, even when nothing is wrong. This is the nervous system adjusting to life without the constant tension of self-maintenance. For years, perhaps decades, energy was spent defending an image, proving a worth, maintaining a narrative. When that effort begins to fall away, the body and mind enter unfamiliar territory. There is less effort but also less structure, less striving but also less certainty. Alan Watts described this as the price of seeing through the illusion of control. The ego believes it is the doer, the chooser, the manager of life. Awakening reveals that life has always been happening on its own. Breathing, thinking, feeling, all arising spontaneously. And when this is glimpsed, the idea of personal control begins to crumble. The mind reacts with fear because control was equated with safety. Without it, existence feels vast and unpredictable. And yet, this vastness is not hostile. It only feels that way because the ego was used to living in a narrow corridor of certainty. Now the walls have fallen away. And while this openness feels like exposure at first, it is also the beginning of real freedom. Not freedom to become anything you want, but freedom from the exhausting need to be someone at all. The sense of losing everything intensifies here because the ego realizes there is no solid ground to return to, no old role that will fully fit again, no identity that can restore the previous sense of security. And this realization can feel devastating. But according to Alan Watts, devastation is simply the clearing of false foundations. What collapses was never meant to carry the weight of existence. And what remains, though subtle and easily overlooked, is far more stable than anything the ego ever constructed. In this stage of awakening, the sense of losing everything often extends to your relationships and social connections. Friends may seem distant, conversations may feel shallow, and familiar routines may no longer provide the comfort they once did. Alan Watts often highlighted that as consciousness expands, the old forms of belonging begin to feel confining. People and situations that once resonated with your old self can now feel misaligned, not because they have changed, but because you have. The shift is internal. Your perception, your awareness, your priorities, all have evolved. This creates a natural tension. On one hand, the old life still exists around you. The home, the family, the responsibilities, the societal expectations. On the other hand, you are no longer fully inhabiting the old self that interacted with these structures. Alan Watts described this as being between worlds. You are neither fully inside the old identity nor fully settled into the emerging self. And this liminal space, while essential for growth, feels like disorientation, even grief. Many people respond to this tension by attempting to force integration. They try to fit in with old social circles, to regain previous routines, or to pursue goals that once felt meaningful. Yet, these attempts often amplify the sense of alienation. Why? Because the awakening process is not about returning to what was, but about seeing the old structures for what they truly are, constructs that served a purpose but were never ultimate reality. Alan Watts frequently emphasized that clinging to the old life only prolongs suffering. Resistance keeps the collapse alive. Acceptance, however, allows transformation to begin. Another characteristic of this phase is a heightened awareness of impermanence. As the ego loosens, you may begin to notice the fleeting nature of experiences, achievements, and relationships with a stark clarity. What once seemed permanent now feels ephemeral. Alan Watts described this realization not as despair, but as an invitation to live more authentically. The collapse, he argued, is a necessary clearing, the pruning of branches so the tree can grow taller, more resilient, more aligned with its natural form. Importantly, this period of collapse is fertile ground for discovery. Stripped of old distractions and compulsions, consciousness begins to perceive subtle realities that were previously hidden. Sensations, emotions, and moments of insight arise in ways that the ego cannot manufacture or control. This is the beginning of true freedom. Freedom not to do whatever you want, but freedom from the compulsive need to be someone specific. The world is no longer measured against the ego's standards, and a deeper, more immediate experience of life becomes accessible. And yet, because this phase is so unfamiliar, it is often terrifying. The ego resists the dissolution of identity because it interprets it as annihilation. But Alan Watts repeatedly reminded us, what is being lost is not you. The core awareness, the observer, the presence, the life force itself remains untouched. The collapse is simply the removal of false supports, the clearing away of illusions that once defined who you thought you were. As this process deepens, you may begin to notice a strange paradox. The more it feels like you are losing everything, the more you are actually gaining. Alan Watts often said that life is a dance between loss and gain, between destruction and creation. The apparent emptiness that arises when the old identity collapses is not a void to be feared, but a space of immense potential. In this clearing, there is no agenda, no story, no persona demanding to be maintained. And from this open space, new insight, creativity, and authenticity can emerge spontaneously. This stage can manifest as a profound detachment from outcomes. Goals, achievements, and accolades no longer hold the same urgency they once did. Even pleasures that were once addictive, success, recognition, validation, lose their grip. Alan Watts explained that when the ego loosens, it can no longer find satisfaction in the old measures of value. This does not mean life becomes meaningless. Rather, meaning begins to arise from a direct encounter with existence itself, not from concepts imposed on it. The collapse is a clearing for direct experience. During this phase, solitude often becomes both necessary and uncomfortable. The old life, with its familiar routines and social validations, cannot provide the depth of understanding you are seeking. Alan Watts described this solitude as a necessary friend of awakening. In it, the mind stops reaching outward for constant affirmation and begins to turn inward, exploring the terrain of consciousness itself. The experience can feel lonely, yes, but it is also where the deepest truths about self and reality begin to surface. Physical and emotional sensations can intensify during this liminal stage. Anxiety, restlessness, or subtle grief may appear without clear cause. Watts suggested that these sensations are the body and mind recalibrating after years of identification with roles, expectations, and compulsions. Just as a house settles after construction, the human system must adjust to living in a less constrained, more expansive way. And while this adjustment can be uncomfortable, it is also an essential part of integrating awakening. A critical insight here is that what feels like loss is not an event to be fixed, but a process to be witnessed. Alan Watts repeatedly emphasized the importance of presence, the act of observing without interference. By noticing the collapse without judgment, you allow the process to unfold naturally. Resistance only strengthens the illusion of loss, while acceptance opens the doorway to freedom. The ego may scream that you are falling apart, but awareness quietly watches, unshaken, and sees that what was falling was never ultimately real. And so, in this stage, you learn a subtle truth. Losing everything is not a catastrophe. It is the necessary dismantling of the old world to make room for the new. The collapse feels like death because the old structures were never you. What remains, the witnessing consciousness, is untouched. It is the ground of freedom, the silent space that has always carried life effortlessly. And when you recognize this, fear begins to soften, and the sensation of true openness begins to emerge. As this phase continues, a subtle shift begins to occur. The sense of loss gradually transforms into a sense of spaciousness. Alan Watts often described this as the difference between clinging to a riverbank and floating freely in the current. At first, letting go feels like being swept away, disoriented and terrified. But gradually, as the ego loosens its grip, you begin to feel the effortless support of life itself. What once seemed like abandonment is actually liberation. What seemed like losing everything is, in truth, returning to a state you have always been in, but never fully known. During this stage, you may also notice a growing intimacy with the present moment. Without the ego constantly projecting into the future or dwelling on the past, attention becomes anchored in the here and now. According to Alan Watts, this is the essence of awakening, the ability to perceive life directly, without the filter of the self that was always interpreting and measuring it. The collapse of identity, while painful initially, is what allows consciousness to see the world freshly, as if for the first time. And in this clarity, even ordinary experiences take on a richness and depth that was previously unnoticed. Relationships, too, begin to shift. You may find that you no longer resonate with people who were once central to your life. Old friendships, romantic connections, or family dynamics may feel strained or even untenable. This is not rejection. It is alignment. As Watts often explained, when consciousness expands, it naturally seeks resonance with what is authentic. The old life cannot provide that resonance, and so separation occurs. Though initially painful, this separation clears space for connections that reflect the true depth of your being rather than the projections of the old ego. A remarkable aspect of this stage is the emergence of self-compassion. Freed from the constant pressure of maintaining an identity, you begin to witness yourself with gentleness. Alan Watts often highlighted that the witnessing consciousness is not judgmental. It observes the collapse, the grief, the confusion, and the fear without condemnation. And in doing so, a new relationship with self arises, one rooted not in achievement or performance, but in simple recognition of what already exists. You are not broken. You are unfolding. Finally, this stage prepares you for the eventual integration of awakening. The collapse is not random, it is purposeful. It removes all that is superfluous, all that obscures the underlying truth of being. What was experienced as losing everything becomes the fertile ground from which freedom, creativity, authenticity, and deep presence can emerge. As Alan Watts would say, the world has always been complete, and so have you. The process simply asks you to notice it, to step into it, and to surrender to what has always been your true home, consciousness itself. At last, the final stage of this awakening phase begins to reveal itself, the recognition that losing everything was never a loss at all. Alan Watts often reminded us that the self we cling to is like a mask, a temporary arrangement of habits, thoughts, and roles. When that mask dissolves, it may feel as though life itself is crumbling. Yet, what remains is consciousness, the ever-present awareness that has been carrying you all along. The collapse is the unveiling, the peeling away of illusions to reveal the stable, unchanging core beneath. In this phase, you begin to notice a profound lightness. Life no longer demands the same effort to feel meaningful. Achievements, possessions, relationships, none are necessary to sustain a sense of being. Alan Watts explained that this is not nihilism. It is freedom. Freedom from the compulsion to define, prove, or perform. Freedom from the tyranny of expectations, from the constant calculation of gain and loss. You discovered that you have been held all along, not by what you controlled, but by what always was, the flow of existence itself. There is also a quiet joy that emerges, subtle yet pervasive. Not the dramatic highs that once energized the ego, but a gentle, unwavering contentment. Watts likened this to being in harmony with the music of life rather than trying to conduct it. You begin to participate in the world effortlessly, guided by presence rather than ambition. The collapse has done its work. By removing all false scaffolding, it has allowed authentic engagement with life to arise spontaneously. You are no longer lost because there was nowhere to be lost. The ground beneath you was always reality, always consciousness, always here. A remarkable feature of this stage is the newfound flexibility of identity. You no longer need rigid definitions of who you are. Alan Watts taught that the self is not a fixed entity, but a fluid, dynamic pattern. When the old forms dissolve, you gain the capacity to flow with life, to respond with authenticity rather than habit. You are no longer bound by the past, the roles you played, or the expectations imposed upon you. You are free to act from presence, to see life freshly in each moment, to meet each situation without the weight of a predetermined self. Finally, this stage is characterized by trust. Not trust in outcomes, not trust in plans or achievements, but trust in the unfolding of life itself. Alan Watts often said, "You are an aperture through which the universe is looking at itself. In losing everything, the ego becomes a transparent lens, allowing awareness to perceive the world directly. The collapse is revealed as a profound gift, the dismantling of illusion that unveils freedom, presence, and clarity." And so, if you feel like you are losing everything during your awakening, remember that this is not the end. It is the prelude to liberation. What you feared as annihilation is actually unveiling. What seemed like loss is revealing what has always been. The collapse is necessary, inevitable, and ultimately merciful. Step gently through it, witness it, surrender to it, and know that on the other side, there is nothing to gain because you have always been already complete. This is the hidden freedom, the quiet joy, and the profound clarity that Alan Watts spoke of. the freedom that arises when the illusions of identity finally fall away.